events, what then, generally speaking, would you say are the highest risk for the markets? In other words, events that could have the highest or have the highest probability of moving markets one way or another.
Taiwan is the risk that looms largest for everyone. If a conflict breaks out over Taiwan, the semiconductor industry is so plugged into the global economy. There are very few industries that would be left untouched from that. A conflict or some sort of blockade of the island would be extremely disruptive for global markets, and it's something that I think a lot of companies are spending more and more time worrying about.
We're talking about the fields of espionage and geopolitical risks with our next guest, who is an expert on both of these areas. He is Louis Sage-Passant. He is currently the founder and editor of Encyclopedia Geopolitics. He's got his own webcast or podcast, How to Get on a Watch List. We'll talk about his work there. He is currently the global head of intelligence at Novo Nordisk, a Danish drug company. He's speaking on his own behalf, though, and not on behalf of Novo Nordisk. And he is currently also a professor at Sciences Po, where he teaches espionage and intelligence. Very, very interesting work. He was also formerly working for British intelligence before working for the private sector. Louis, welcome to the show. I appreciate you being here.
David, thanks very much for having me.
Looking forward very much to talking today. Tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started on the topics du jour. You told me offline you started off in British intelligence, moved into the private sector. What was that journey?
Yeah, so it's one that I see a lot of people across the field taking. So I started out in the British military. I was an infantry officer and ended up doing a tour as an intelligence officer. Really caught the bug for this whole world of intelligence. And after leaving the military, I joined an energy company in the Middle East that was specifically looking for an intelligence analyst, looking at geopolitical risk, countering security threats such as terrorism. This was in the wake of the In Amenas attacks in Algeria, where a number of oil and gas workers had been taken hostage by a militant group. So the industry started paying a lot of attention to these threats. Following that, I moved out to Asia Pacific, where I worked for one of the big US investment banks, doing crisis management and geopolitical risk for them. So very much looking at the same kind of threats, the same sorts of issues across the region. And then a few years ago, after a brief pause, kind of self-employed, working in the travel security space, I moved across to the tech industry, where I worked for Salesforce, the US tech firm, looking at security and intelligence issues for them, really trying to look more at strategic intelligence with them, so how big picture geopolitics can shape the company's strategy. And then last year, after completing my PhD in the same field, I'm sure you're seeing a theme here, I moved across to the pharma sector, where I joined Novo Nordisk as their global head of intelligence. So very much the same, helping the company navigate all of the various problems we see in the headlines around the world today, so that they can do what they need to do globally.
So post 9/11, how have the Western allies and the G7 countries changed their outlook and their perception on counterterrorism and fortified their defenses that way?
It's a good question. I think a lot's changed. So I think pre 9/11, if you think back, we were in this kind of unipolar moment where geopolitics almost didn't matter, especially for kind of the markets, for the economy. Governments really got focused on kind of regional issues. 9/11 was very much a clarifying moment, I think, both for industry and governments, that there was suddenly this threat that terrorism was presenting. Everything really shifted onto the terrorism front for a while. Big picture geopolitics took a bit of a back seat. What we're seeing in recent years, in particular, sort of post 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, but even more so post 2022, is this return of great power politics. And as a result, the kind of espionage threat that comes along with this, you're seeing a lot in the media right now about governments raising a lot of noise about the threat of sabotage, which is very much the thematic topic here in Europe at the moment, against privately owned infrastructure, as well as espionage, kind of stealing trade secrets and so on. So there's a lot of effort to focus on this. I think there's this understanding that great power politics means a kind of scramble to carve off sections of the economy among the great powers, that they're trying to secure their own supply chains, and they're realizing a lot of that sits within the private sector. So you're seeing a lot of cooperation across the lines, and things like intelligence and espionage, the kind of intelligence tradecraft that was traditionally thought of as something very government-centric, is now bleeding out into the private sector, companies having to pay a lot more attention to these kind of risks.
Generally speaking, how would you evaluate the current threat of terrorism today versus, let's say, 20 years ago? Is it more significant, less significant because of the emergence of or re-emergence of great power struggles?
So I think it's less significant in the sense that 20 years ago, we're right after 9/11. We're on the eve of the invasion of Iraq. The threat was very much there. There were large organized terrorist, transnational terrorist groups, and the kind of government threat was very much still organized in that direction. I think these days the recent Moscow attack has reminded us that the threat is still there. It's not something we can clap our hands and say job done. The focus is very much on that great power competition, but the threat of terrorism is still there, lurking in the background. So it's a problem, but it's a less pressing one than I think what we're focusing on these days, which is more that kind of interstate competition.
Is it possible to see a transition from jihadist-backed terrorism groups to more state-funded and sponsored terrorist groups and orchestrated events?
We're seeing that play out in the Middle East right now. We are seeing conversations around state-sponsored proxy groups. We're seeing that with the Red Sea crisis, for example. I think states are realizing that if they can't compete directly with G7 nations, one of the alternatives is to use proxies to find kind of covert ways to fund and train and arm them and set them loose.
Channel in the Red Sea that separates Africa from Yemen. Over 15 attacks have already been recorded. And this channel's part of a crucial shipping route. To the north is the Suez Canal, which connects Asia and Europe. Around 12% of global trade goes through it. Some of the ships in the Red Sea are heading to Israel. And the Houthis say it's ships with Israeli connections that are their target.
So that can be quite a disruptive act. It can tie up a lot of resources, as we're seeing with the Red Sea crisis. So I think absolutely it is an issue. At the same time, I think the kind of reputational ramifications for most governments of especially sponsoring kind of jihadi terrorism, the type that is conducting, mass casualty attacks against civilian targets, that's a very high risk move. And most governments are pretty nervous about working with these kind of organizations. Even some of the most extreme regimes out there, I think, still have a pretty suspicious view of these kinds of organizations. So I think less jihadis and more kind of those proxy groups that can be used as geopolitical levers.
Okay. And domestic terrorism, is that on your radar, or the radars of corporations that need to be, I guess, vigilant? The risk of civil unrest and domestic violence?
Absolutely. Civil unrest, definitely. We've seen post-COVID in particular, a lot of disruption to markets, to businesses from civil unrest. I often think that, a lot of the protest activity in the US in the kind of COVID era drove a lot of growth in my particular industry. I think a lot of corporations had previously, especially American corporations, had previously seen civil unrest as something happening kind of over there in far-flung exotic places. And we're now seeing it on Main Street, USA. And as a result, they sort of saw a need to invest in security and intelligence to help direct that security. I think from the domestic terrorism front, absolutely, we're seeing politics across Europe, across America, getting more and more polarized. And with that, there is always the risk of domestic actors becoming radicalized. We're also seeing corporations getting caught up in those risks. When I was interviewing practitioners across the field for some of my research, what I was finding was that more and more companies were getting worried about acts of sabotage, direct targeting, because their corporation had either taken a political stance or had been perceived to take a political stance that was perhaps unpopular with certain more politically extreme segments of the population. We're seeing governments and corporations get into kind of reputational battles, getting into kind of political spats. We saw that with Disney in Florida, for example, a couple of years ago. So I think that is an area that companies are certainly paying attention to.
Before we get into specific recent news events, what then, generally speaking, would you say are the highest risks for the markets? In other words, events that could have the highest or have the highest probability of moving markets one way or another?
I think in terms of the kind of market impact, I think Taiwan is the risk that looms largest for everyone. If a conflict breaks out over Taiwan, the semiconductor industry is so plugged into the global economy. There are very few industries that would be left untouched from that. A conflict or some sort of blockade of the island would be extremely disruptive for global markets. And it's something that I think a lot of companies are spending more and more time worrying about. I think beyond that, what we're starting to see bleed over from the conflict in Ukraine, as evidenced by various intelligence agencies' briefings in recent months, is a worry about kind of state-sponsored sabotage on critical national infrastructure, things that could be potentially very disruptive to markets, especially kind of subsea communications cables and things like that. So I think there's a variety of ways folks like me think about pretty much all day long, kind of how these could emerge and what they would mean for various companies. It's hard to say beyond something like Taiwan and a kind of global semiconductor shortage. It's hard to point to specific incidents that would have kind of market-wide implications. Often, while there certainly are some we can focus on, what folks like me look for are those very specific problems that come up for specific industries or specific companies. So, something that would impact a tech company in Silicon Valley is going to be very different as a risk to something that would impact the energy sector in the Middle East, for example. So there certainly are big issues we're watching for, but trying to find those acute ones, I think, is the more valuable use of time for folks in the field.
Okay. Is there any concern for cybersecurity risks? We saw Sony get hacked a couple of years ago. Certainly that's a concern for investors and shareholders.
Absolutely. Now, I'm not a cybersecurity expert. My domain is very much in the kind of physical security world, but it's something we are worried about. One thing I have noticed in that area, and speaking to people who are cybersecurity experts, is this transition away from transnational criminal cyber threats towards state-sponsored actors. I think that's something drawing more attention. These actors have far more resources. They have far greater capabilities at their hands. And unlike kind of the criminally motivated actors who are potentially just looking to make a little bit of money and therefore can often be negotiated with in the case of things like ransomware, state-sponsored actors, often their goal is political. It's to be destructive. It's to be disruptive. There's not really a negotiation to be had there. So that has changed the game as I understand it. But like I say, that's very much not my area of expertise.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Taiwan first. Then since you brought that up. So just today on Monday, the new Taiwanese president was sworn in. Inauguration was today. Lai Ching-te, former vice president. He is a former doctor who is self-described as a pragmatic worker for Taiwan's independence. He is a separatist whom China has called a troublemaker. Certainly, this is not a deviation from his predecessor's policies, but it's also not a step into reunification and de-escalation between the two powers across the Taiwan Straits. Where do you see this issue headed? How is this going to play out, do you think?
So I think in terms of risk, there's a few things that worry me in particular. Is that one, we're starting to see more and more military tension in the Taiwan Straits. We're seeing more and more kind of close encounters between aircraft, warships of all the various actors involved, Taiwan's allies, China, and so on. And that leaves a lot of room for miscalculation. It would be very easy for an unintended escalation as a result of a miscalculation or just a simple mistake. And with so much tension and kind of the reduced diplomatic contact happening between the various actors these days, that's something that worries me greatly, that no one's particularly looking to escalate. It's just one of those things that can happen on its own. In terms of where it's happening broadly, I think we're starting to see, again, more companies, more governments paying attention to this risk. It's something that I think the last 30 years, being relatively geopolitically calm, have lulled the markets into something of a false sense of security when it comes to geopolitical risk. And I think what we're seeing now is that kind of almost naivety coming to an end. People are realizing that this could be incredibly disruptive and very quickly. So they're starting to look at making investments elsewhere. We're seeing that with TSMC's investments in places like Arizona in the US to try and spread that risk geopolitically. But of course, those factories are going to take time to come online. And in the meantime, there is vulnerability to the global economy. If something were to happen, that could be extremely disruptive. So I think we are heading towards, we're already in a period of tension. And I think that's only going to continue for the foreseeable future.
In a statement, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken congratulated Lai on his inauguration and said the U.S. is looking forward to working with him to advance our shared interests and values, deepen our longstanding unofficial relationship, and maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. I can't imagine the Chinese government being happy about that statement. Where does the U.S. stand on this issue? In other words, what is the U.S. interest in being, I would say, involved or some would say, interfering in the Taiwan Strait?
So I think that the US interest is very much in maintaining the status quo. They see Taiwan as a pretty vibrant democracy, as something to be nurtured, as the US has wanted to do around the world. But their official position is very much rooted in the One China policy, where they unofficially kind of recognize that there is a dispute there, but officially their position is kind of, we recognize there is this problem, we don't have an opinion on it, but of course, practically speaking, they do. I think that is working from the US perspective for now. It really is going to depend on China and Beijing's patience when it comes to this matter. China is naturally unhappy, as you say, and I think statements like this can be seen as provocative in Beijing, and that does raise the risk that they will try to kind of respond with some sort of tension-raising activity.
Now, you mentioned that this is something that everyone's watching. At what point does this issue get out of control? Neither side at this point seems to be yielding. Xi Jinping has made it abundantly clear that his mission is to reunify the two forces soon, right? And Taiwan's current government is not interested in negotiating for any sort of reunification. So this is an issue of unstoppable force meets immovable object. At what point does this stop becoming rhetoric and become hot?
I think once we cross the point of no return, right now it's there's no specific deadline set. I know various dates have been thrown around by military analysts, but in reality, I think the position in Beijing is reunification is the end goal. If it needs to be by force, so be it. But they're also not closing the door to peaceful reunification by political means. So they're not closing the door to a potentially more friendly government in the future. A change in the economic winds that means more people are advocating for a closer relationship with the mainland. I think once we see some sort of point of no return that precludes those kind of options. If we see statements from the government in Beijing setting a deadline, putting personal political reputations at stake by kind of reacting, I think that's where it would become the point to worry. Like I say, though, the wild card there is that there are a lot of warships and fighter aircraft flying around in the seas around Taiwan at the moment, and a miscalculation and an accident could raise the temperature very, very quickly. I think if we were to see an incident that resulted in death of service personnel on any of the sides involved, I think those are the kind of incidents that can spiral out of control quite quickly if the political momentum gets behind it. I think the recent tariffs are raising the temperature. I think the breakdown of kind of free trade across both countries, the US and China, is something that is unfortunately more likely to provoke an escalation there. I think China is already considering sort of tit-for-tat retaliatory measures. So I think as long as there's dialogue, as long as there's a way back, I remain optimistic. But I think as those doors start closing, obviously it becomes riskier.
How significant is the U.S. administration's promise to back Taiwan militarily should things escalate to a kinetic war? Is that a real promise, or is that just something that the U.S. is saying to prevent an escalation?
Well, the US position's always been strategic ambiguity. It's been very much, you're not going to know what our response is, which raises the stakes of any kind of action, because essentially it's an unknown. I think it would very much depend who's in power in the White House at the time. We've seen Biden seems to take a pretty strong kind of internationalist approach to foreign policy. I think he is willing to intervene. Whereas I think, for example, post-November, if we were to return to a Trump White House, Trump sees much more of a deal-making style of diplomacy. I think his business background has really given him the sense of we don't necessarily have to intervene for intervention's sake. We may be able to find some sort of deal there. So it's really going to depend on who sits within the White House. And I think the policy is very much designed with that flexibility in mind.
Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about another region, the Middle East. So just last night on the 19th of May, a helicopter containing or carrying Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi and the former minister, rather, of Iran crashed during a storm. It was reported that there are no survivors of this crash. The question is whether or not foreign policy towards Israel would change following a replacement.
I don't see any major shift there. Power in Iran very much is vested within the supreme leader, so I don't see an immediate shift there. I think I believe the first vice president has already been kind of queued up to take the president's place, but I expect foreign policy continuity on that front. I think where things may change is the succession plan for the Supreme Leader is underway. The two leading candidates were Raisi and the Supreme Leader's son. And there are concerns that now with Raisi obviously out of the picture, that this would become essentially a kind of linear succession, some sort of dynastic system, which I think is something that domestically in Iran does raise the stakes a little bit, does raise the risk of domestic instability. We've seen attendance at presidential elections declined significantly in recent months. This was some of the lowest voter turnout in recent history in Iran, which is showing a degree of public disillusionment with the political system in the country. We've also seen the hijab law protests across the country, which have subsided now, but that did demonstrate that below the surface there is this degree of public discontent. So it's something I think we have to watch very closely now, more on the domestic side than the foreign policy side.
As an intelligence expert and analyst, would you ask yourself whether or not foul play has been involved?
I think it's something I always teach my students is, when you're looking at these kind of events, is to apply Occam's razor, look for the simple explanations. Always have multiple hypotheses in your back pocket. There's a number of intelligence analysis techniques that rely on generating several explanations and then holding kind of Olympics between them to try and find out what is the most likely explanation. In this case, given the weather, given the age of Iran's helicopter fleet, the sanctions making it much harder to procure spare parts and conduct regular maintenance, I think a simple accident is by far the most likely explanation. That said, as you allude to there, there's a lot of tension in the region right now. Iran is involved in a number of kind of shadow war conflicts with various neighbors, including Israel. So I would imagine that there will be suspicion of fair play. The region does tend to have a leaning towards conspiratorial mindsets around these kind of things. Given the succession planning for the Supreme Leader, I have no doubt people will be asking that question. But really, I suspect it's simple accident more than anything.
Does it seem to you like both sides, Israel and Iran, are interested in escalating the war? The drone strike that Iran launched was, all but ineffective. I don't know if they wanted it to be actually ineffective. It was shot down very easily by Israel's Iron Dome system and allies in the region. And Israel's counterstrike with a missile didn't really, it wasn't aimed to do much either. Is this just posturing from both sides, or is there actual genuine interest in maintaining a war?
No, I think posturing is exactly how I would describe it. That said, there were hundreds of missiles launched and drones launched by Iran. That's not something you do with the intention of them all being intercepted. Intercepting missiles is a very, very tricky art, and there is always the risk that one or many get through. So I think in terms of a retaliation, I think it was a real retaliation, but I think the statements around, this matter has been concluded, I believe was how Iran put it, pretty much while the drones were still in flight, is very much a clear signal of this is a warning shot. We don't intend to retaliate from here. I think Israel's response targeting a fairly sensitive military facility pretty much smack bang in the heart of Iran was a signal to say we could have done much more here, but we're not going to. We've struck this one solitary target. Doesn't look like they actually inflicted much damage there. I think a strategic air defense system was destroyed, but it was again a very clear shot across the bow saying we could have done more if we wanted to. So let's stop here, and it seems to have worked for now. Things seem to have calmed down again. I would expect the two sides to return to their kind of proxy conflict and their shadow war, their kind of clandestine war that's been going on in various countries across the region.
At what point does the U.S. get involved in this conflict? By involved, I mean militarily.
Well, I suppose they already have. When you consider the defense of Israel against the Iranian drone and missile strikes, a number were shot down by US forces, as well as British, Jordanian, and other allies across the region. So I think at this stage they are already involved. They're sending a clear deterrence signal. I think the repositioning of carrier battle groups to the Eastern Mediterranean is a further signal, especially looking at Lebanon as a kind of warning to Hezbollah, telling them to stay out of the fight as well. So I think the US is playing a role role, but it's trying to avoid a direct intervention as much as possible. I think were we to see a significant escalation across the region, a continuation of the strikes, especially against US forces, as we saw in Jordan a few months back, I think those are the kind of things that, regardless of US preferences, would end up pulling the White House into the fight.
But do you see a scenario in which the U.S. launches offensive measures or operations into Iran itself?
I think it's clear by the response to the Tower, I believe it was Tower 22 strike in Jordan, where 3 US service personnel were killed, that the US does not want a direct intervention. I think recent history has shown us that interventions in the Middle East have been pretty unpopular for the US. Troops are pretty much only just now getting the dust off their boots from Afghanistan. I think another intervention this time in Iran would be deeply unpopular, especially in an election year. That would be a very dangerous move. I think the impact on energy prices is something that the US is very worried about right now. I think any impact on the Strait of Hormuz is something that wouldn't be tolerated in an election year. So I think there is enormous reluctance at this stage. I don't think they would rule it out. I think there are certainly escalations possible that would demand some sort of US intervention, but I think it would very much be a choice of last resort.
Do you think this reluctance would dissipate following November this year, meaning either Trump or Biden, it doesn't matter who wins, we would get a second-term president? Now, a second-term president means that neither of them are concerned about re-election, which means, in theory, they're both likely to take on more risks. So perhaps there would be less reluctance going forward, or not.
It's certainly possible, but I think they're still, they are still sensitive to public opinion on these issues, and those issues will remain almost universally unpopular across the US, outside of some very hawkish quarters of Washington. So I think at this stage, you're absolutely right. The risk would increase, the restraint would certainly decrease, but I don't think by an enormous amount, because there's very little interest at this stage. I think also what we're seeing right now is that Iran does seem to be deterred. Iranian action has been very, very quiet since recent events. So I think as a result, they would see the strategy as working. Were that to change, then absolutely intervention couldn't be ruled out. But like I said, I think it's economically quite a dangerous move, and I think it would be pretty unpopular across the board.
Okay, and let's move on to Ukraine now. Some recent developments were noteworthy to bring up. There are now military exercises conducted by NATO along the Russian border in Latvia. Russia is allegedly behind attacks on a European undersea gas pipeline recently, and Putin replaced its defense minister. And Ukraine has lowered its military draft age from 27 to 25, all while Putin has recently talked about the possibility of testing tactical nuclear nukes or nuclear weapons during this war. So things don't seem to be de-escalating, but they're not, really escalating out of control just yet. How are you reading this situation?
I would match your description there. Yeah, I think while there is escalatory language, I think Russian nuclear posturing is something we see pretty much on a regular basis at this point. So it's not something that I would read too much into. I think NATO exercises along the border is a very much seen as a necessary reassurance by those member states. There has long been a fear of NATO's response to an intervention or an invasion of the Baltic states being to essentially do a fighting retreat and then try to retake those states later on in any conflict. That posture seems to have changed now, and it's very much to defend those states. And as a result, that's requiring a much greater commitment. And I think these exercises are very much meant as a deterrent signal. I think President Macron here in France has made some pretty astute statements in recent months along these lines, kind of saying, we keep drawing red lines for ourselves, and that is allowing Russia to choose what they want to do, that we are giving them space to operate in. So if we take a more ambiguous posture and we kind of say we're not going to rule out responses, we're not going to rule out certain options for ourselves, that makes it much harder for Russia to take a position of antagonism against NATO member states. And I think those exercises in the Baltics are designed as that. They are to say we have a strong military presence here, and any intervention would be met with force. At the same time, I think no one is trying to deliberately escalate it. I believe it is a purely defensive posturing measure at this stage. I don't think the risk is enormous either. I think Russian forces are very much tied up in Ukraine at this point. I don't think they are in a position to generate forces to attack the Baltics or other NATO member states. That said, this is settling in to be a long war. I think the recent reshuffling of the defense ministry in Moscow is showing that. The appointment of an economist to the position of defense minister is very much a signal, I believe, from the Kremlin to kind of say, look, we are in this for the long fight. Let's make sure that the military have the resources they require. At the same time, support for Ukraine in Europe and America has been waning. We've seen that in recent months with the delayed aid package to Ukraine, which was finally passed. And I think those things are starting to show a shift in the balance. And that is something Russia is counting on. I think that is what their strategy relies on, is to try and simply outlast the West on this. So I think those NATO posturing kind of exercises on the border are a powerful antidote to that, to say that the interest in defending NATO territory hasn't waned.
Given the loss of public interest or waning of public interest, like you talked about, do you think Putin is likely to escalate pressure before November just to see how the West will respond?
I think he's probably likely to try and calculate what is the most beneficial route at this stage. And he doesn't want to turn up the temperature too much, because that would regenerate public support for Ukraine. So I think at this stage, his most sensible move would be to just sit back and let the war play out, let it drag out. That said, that doesn't seem to be the case. We are seeing sabotage attacks across Europe. Intelligence services are now very vocally warning about them. Now, these kind of attacks, they take time to plan. The average kind of covert operation by the Russian forces is believed to take about 6 months to plan and execute. So the attacks we're seeing today were probably organized late summer last year. So this is a bit of a delayed action. If you look at what was happening late last summer, Ukraine was still on the counteroffensive. Russian forces were looking quite fragile, and support to Ukraine was still pretty strong. So it kind of makes sense that these would be the choices you would make in the run up to that situation. But I think now what you're seeing is those actions coming to fruition, those attacks across Europe, and there is always the risk with those attacks that someone gets hurt, critical infrastructure is damaged, and that could very easily galvanize public support against Russia behind Ukraine and for a more hawkish policy. We are starting to see defense spending ramp up across the continent in various countries. Even those with fairly kind of center-left politics are starting to really ramp up military spending. So that provocation has already happened. As it comes to the US elections, I think at this stage there's so much polarization in the US. It's an environment ripe for disinformation operations and for those kind of covert interference operations. So it's something I would be surprised not to see. It's been happening all along for the last few years, and I think that's only likely to continue.
Okay. Russia's army has reportedly grown in size by the order of 15% since the beginning of the war, since the invasion of Ukraine. It's been able to replenish its losses on the battlefield. It's allocated more budget to the military since the invasion of Ukraine. Is there a reluctance militarily from Russia to, fully escalate? In other words, is there a technical inability to do so besides politics?
I would say that that's right. At the end of the day, Russia's economy is about parallel to Italy's. It's not an enormous economic might there, and unlike Italy, it's not as industrialized, and it's not surrounded by one of the strongest military alliances we've ever seen in human history. So I think from a technical perspective, Russia is outmatched on that front. When it comes to kind of the desire at this stage, I think their hands are very much full in Ukraine. Although the size of the military has increased, as you say, the quality hasn't. These are not well-trained troops. These are not the kind of elite forces that were in existence on day one of the invasion. These are very hastily pulled together organizations. We're seeing older and older equipment appearing on the battlefield from Russian deep storage. So this does come with a price. The other side of it is that their economy is starting to switch to a war economy, and in the short term to the medium term, that is quite beneficial. Europe is still ramping up ammunition production, as is the US. For the short term, there does seem to be an advantage on Russia's side in terms of artillery availability. The balance of fires, as we refer to it, is very much in Russia's favor on the front line right now. But that's only going to last so long. As Europe and the US do start to reindustrialize militarily, Russia simply isn't capable of keeping up. And at the same time, all of the kind of focus on the front, getting everything to the front line from Russia's perspective right now is causing harms to its own domestic economy. There are severe worker shortages that's driving significant inflation. We are seeing the economy running very, very hot right now. So it's something that I think Russia is playing a bit of a devil's bargain. It's very difficult for them to sustain this for the long term. And if they do, if Europe and the US are able to keep that sustainment on their side, I think Russia will simply be outmatched.
NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg said last year that he sees long-term Ukraine to join NATO, but in the intermediate term, for now, it needs to remain independent. I don't understand that message. Some would say that's mixed signaling. How are you reading this?
Well, if you think about this structure of NATO, an attack on one is an attack on all. That makes having a new member that is currently engaged in a war a very difficult proposition, because essentially it means were Ukraine to join NATO tomorrow, all of NATO is at war with Russia tomorrow, and that is a very dangerous situation, especially when, as you've alluded to, everyone's trying to kind of de-escalate while remaining
wouldn't that
kind of in a strong posture.
Wouldn't that immediately, in theory, put an end to the war? I mean, if Russia doesn't want a war with the rest of the world, it would immediately pull back.
Potentially, but Putin has staked a lot of his personal political reputation on this conflict. It would be very difficult for him to step back straight away. I think that would actually risk being a very escalatory move. It would happen so quickly in the circumstance you've described there that it wouldn't leave a lot of room for good decision making. So I think that's precisely what Stoltenberg's alluding to here, is that there is a very challenging position for Ukraine once the conflict is resolved, as all conflicts are broadly resolved, unless we end up in some sort of Korean Peninsula type situation of a kind of frozen conflict. Then it would become much easier to revisit that discussion and to consider a NATO membership for Ukraine. But right now, that's simply a very, very live and dangerous issue.
What measures does Russia have right now, or tools does it have to put more political pressure on the West, either political or economic pressure?
To be honest, I think they're already maxed out in that regard. We're seeing the sabotage operations, which, like I say, are a fine line between being disruptive to especially military industry, sending deterrent signals, but not galvanizing political support for Ukraine or against Russia. So there's a very delicate balance for them there. Militarily, they're pretty much maxed out with the conflict in Ukraine. While they do have nuclear weapons, so do a number of other powers, especially allies of Ukraine. So at this stage, I don't think there's much more they can do to escalate. I think we're pretty much there. It's really about sustaining it, trying to outlast Western interest in supporting Ukraine.
Okay. I want to close off on some of the work that you're doing. So you have a new book coming out. Tell us about some of the themes of that book.
Yeah, so the book is called Beyond States and Spies, the Security Intelligence Services of the Private Sector. So what I've been looking at is I sat down and interviewed about 60 of the largest companies' security intelligence teams. So folks across all sorts of different industries in the largest American and international corporations to understand how they're seeing the world and what they're doing about it. And some really interesting themes came back to me. Right now, we're seeing an absolute explosion in the geopolitical risk space with a huge degree of investment by companies. Pretty much everyone, if they didn't already have an intelligence team, is in the process of building one. Companies are really having to wrestle with these issues so that they've got someone they can turn to when there is a Red Sea crisis, when a ship is getting missiles shot at it, and they can say, what does this mean for us? Is this going to disrupt our supply chains? What can we do to kind of strategically to respond to this? So the book looks at the history of the field and how companies have been doing this for quite literally hundreds of years, in some cases for longer than even organized states intelligence operations have been taking place. As long as there's been global commerce, there's been a need to understand the globe, understand geopolitics. I look at the kind of practical application of intelligence, so how companies are using it to solve these problems. And then I dive into the ethics of the field and look at kind of what it means to be in a world where private corporations have the same kinds of intelligence capabilities as many governments.
Is there a possibility or risk that there will be less globalization as a result of heightened geopolitical tensions? I presume that it's possibly one of the things that companies are thinking about, which is that, well, why risk our supply chains in the Red Sea when when we could vertically integrate domestically and avoid those risks abroad?
Absolutely. We're already seeing that. We're seeing this kind of, I wouldn't go as far as calling it deglobalization, but we're certainly hearing talk about de-risking or decoupling a lot across the board. We're seeing things like friendshoring being thrown around. And that is not just a cliche at this stage. We're starting to see foreign direct investment flows actually correlating with UN voting habits by bloc, meaning people are investing more in their friends. People are not voting. They're not investing across voting lines, because that tends to indicate they're crossing geopolitical boundaries, and any boundary crossing business is introducing friction to your operations. So I think we are seeing more and more of this. Companies are starting to understand that just-in-time supply chains are very, very exposed to disruption in this kind of world. So they're starting to build just-in-case supply chains where they have buffers, they have reserves, they have supply stocks, so that they can take these kind of shocks without too much disruption. So it's something I think we're going to see more and more of. We're going to see this more orientation, I think, to operating in a kind of multi-block global economy, where you may have to run your business differently and according to different regulations in different parts of the world. So this is something I think we're going to see more of, but it's certainly already happening.
You have an interesting podcast I mentioned in the beginning of the interview, How to Get on a Watch List. The title of the channel, I believe, is Encyclopedia Geopolitical, right? That's something that you run. People need to check this out. You've got the best titles. How to Get on a Watch List, How to Sabotage a Supply Chain, How to Run a Troll Farm, How to Wage Economic Warfare, How to Steal Corporate Secrets. It's this... I haven't watched the episodes myself, admittedly, but now I will. Is this a masterclass on how to get yourself on the FBI watch list? What's going on? Yeah.
We did actually notice that for some of the episodes, we noticed that our kind of download map started to look really interesting. It was sort of jihadi hotspots in the world, where we found our episodes on how to shoot down an airline were really popular.
Boy.
The reality is we're all kind of intelligence professionals, public and private sector on the show. We have no desire to kind of spread dangerous information. So the focus of the show is very much on how do we prevent these things from happening, despite the catchy title. We realize we know a lot of fairly interesting people who are working. This is
very smart. You put this catchy title, and then you track who searches those key terms and watches it, and they're on the watch list. That's very smart, right?
It's just good marketing. But we find we get some really interesting discussions in there. We talk about the threat, but we also talk about how to stop the threat, the various agencies and what companies are doing about it. So we tap into some of the really interesting experts that we have in the intelligence field, and we have a lot of fun making it.
Can you share with us one or two, I would guess, really interesting encounters you've had, either screening for criminals or analyzing a watch list over your career that you could possibly share with the public?
I'd have to be careful of what I talk about there, but I'd say, we're seeing more and more in the corporate sector a focus on protecting corporate secrets from espionage. Companies are starting to really invest in what's often referred to as insider risk or kind of counterintelligence programs. And that's something that's getting more and more sophisticated across the field. I've seen some technology in recent months that has frankly blown my mind. Stuff that back when I was in the military, governments could barely do is now very commonplace in the corporate sector. There are some technologies out there that are able to screen for kind of targets of interest within your company, and then allow your company to match up those potential targets with the scientists or the engineers that you have working for you. So let's say you're a technology company, and you've got this guy David Lin working for you, and you see he's a global expert in some particular technology, and you see that various nation states have that on their shopping list. It tells you, go talk to this guy, have a conversation with him, make sure he knows that when he's traveling, he's not using his laptop publicly where people can see it, make sure he understands he might be being followed, or someone might be, trying to get close to him to kind of coerce him into doing something. So there's some really sophisticated stuff going on in the field right now, really comparable with governments.
Okay, I don't have time to talk about all these episodes. I encourage people to check out your work there. But one that is particularly curious to me of personal interest, How to Kill a Journalist. I suppose you mean how to prevent yourself from being a target. Can you tell us about your findings there? It's a 44-minute episode.
Yeah, so we sat down with Dr. Mark Grant, who is he's a head of security for a number of news channels. He's I believe he's former Sky News and BBC, and he's a real expert in everything to do with keeping journalists safe. So despite the rather gory and shocky title, what we talk about there is what are the threats journalists face in the field, and that's everything from reporting in conflict zones through to dissident journalism and being silenced for perhaps reporting on what some might deem the wrong topics, through to how do we keep them safe? How does a news organization keep their journalists safe? And it's quite an interesting one. As a security professional, we're often working with people who, when something's exploding, when things are getting dangerous, our people want to move away from the area. It's very easy for us to say, okay, we're going to evacuate you. If you're working to protect journalists, these are some of the few people who actually say, no, I want to get closer. I actually want to go to the explosions. So it's a very, very complex and very challenging job. And Mark and his team do phenomenal work in that space. So it was really interesting listening to him talk about this. And then we had another episode with another journalist called Rosie Garthwaite, called How to Avoid Being Killed in a War Zone, which is the title of her phenomenal book. She's a conflict journalist who's worked in some very, very high-risk places. And those two episodes together are quite interesting because she shares some of her personal stories of some quite hair-raising situations she's been in. So it's a really, I think, courageous field that these people are in, and a really important one.
There's a bunch of other episodes that may be of interest to my viewers: how to launder money, how to break the internet, how to get rich stealing or selling fake drugs online. That's an interesting topic. Finally, you have one: how to steal a nuke. Now, people have talked about the possibility of building, I guess, tactical nuclear weapons from scratch or without government assistance. How likely is it that we can see a terrorist group do this on their own? Is this a significant threat?
My takeaway from that interview, we sat down with Vitaly Fedchenko from SIPRI, really impressive nuclear security expert. I came away reassured. Really a lot of that conversation was about how technically difficult this is, how many controls are in place. That said, we are in an environment where there are conflicts taking place around nuclear facilities. There are, various nation states that are looking pretty shaky. So there is always a risk there. And it's something that I think governments are worrying about quite a lot. But thankfully, there are, people like Vitaly and his team that are spending a lot of time thinking about this and advising on how to solve that problem.
Okay. Well, that sounds like the plot of several movies, so we'll leave it there. Lewis, thank you very much for your time today. Where can we learn more about you? Where else can we follow you?
Well, thanks very much, David. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I'm on LinkedIn. I post quite regularly there about geopolitical risk and what it means for companies, and also Encyclopedia Geopolitica, which is a blog I run with a number of people across the industry, where we talk a lot about both the government and the kind of private side of these issues.
Okay.
So always happy for people to reach out or follow me there.
All right. Very good. Thank you very much, Lewis. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.